My name is Sydney Lynn, and I'm a 2024 Coolidge Scholar and a student at the Bronx High School of Science. We will now begin our first session titled America's Dutch and English Heritage. The moderator of this session is Garland Tucker. Mr. Tucker is the retired chairman and CEO of Triangle Capital Corporation, as well as a former co-founder of First Travel Corp. He serves on the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Mr. Tucker is also the author of the most recent Coolidge Press publication, 1924, Coolidge, Davis, and the High Tide of American Conservatism. Please welcome Mr. Tucker and our esteemed panelists.
I don't know who it was who made the comment that it was a bad thing for a leader to be moving along and turn around and see nobody following. That was kind of the sensation I had when I was walking up here, wondering where the panel was. Well, good morning. I'm Garland Tucker, and I'm going to be the moderator for this first session. I want to thank you all for being here and for helping us get started today. As you've just heard, the first session this morning is entitled America's Dutch and English Heritage, and this panel will show you the ideas that had a big impact on the founders. And some of these are very understudied ideas, so I hope we all will learn a lot from this session. The English advances in political liberty from the Magna Carta form the very core of the American tradition. Britain's common law became the crown jewel of that tradition, restraining monarchs through long reverenced precedent and reasoned arguments, especially in the protection of private property against aristocratic encroachment. Now, Scotland had its own Enlightenment that greatly influenced the framers, and among the key influences also were the Dutch, what was going on in Holland at this time, and perhaps that's the most underrated, least understood of the components we'll look at today. Another little discussed subject we will hear about today is the Glorious Revolution and its principal authors, King William and Queen Mary. I want to close my introduction with by giving you two quotes. One from appropriately our patron saint Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge wrote, said, "But if these truths to which the Declaration, as the Declaration of Independence refers, have not before been adopted in their combined entirety by any other national authority, it is a fact that they have long been pondered and often expressed in political speculation in other countries." And then the other quote is from Russell Kirk, the American conservative, and he wrote that the American Revolution was in fact a revolution not made but prevented. The American founders saw themselves as restoring the traditional rights of Englishmen. The French Revolution, by contrast, utterly overturned the old political and social order. The American revolutionaries in general had a very different view than the French revolutionaries. The Americans in general held a biblical view of man and his bent towards sin, while the French revolutionaries in general attempted to substitute for the biblical understanding an optimistic doctrine of human goodness advanced by the philosophers of the rationalistic Enlightenment. The American view led to the Constitution of 1787, the French view to the terror and the new autocracy. We'll hear more about some of those things a little bit later in the panel and later in the day. We're joined by a terrific panel today. What I'm going to do is introduce each one individually. We've been all warned that we have 10 minutes. Each panelist has 10 minutes. I'm not sure what Matt's going to do when the 10 minutes expires, but we've been severely warned not to go over that. Our first speaker is someone who's familiar to most of us, both his writings and probably his face too, because he appears fairly regularly commenting on the political scene, and that's Michael Barone. He's authored and co-authored many books, including the Almanac of American Politics, which was published since 1971. You'll find more about Michael in your program, but the important fact is that he's a deep scholar of an event obscure and far away to Americans, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. No book captures the stunning shift that the accession of William and Mary to the throne better than Michael's book, Our First Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Michael Barone.
Well, thank you. In late October 1894, in his senior year at Amherst College, Amity Shlaes writes in her biography of Calvin Coolidge, he debated Charles Burnett on the topic of, do the United States owe more to England or to Holland? This debate topic would surely puzzle most 21st century students who've been taught that cultural and ethnic diversity came to America only in the last few decades. But the undergraduate Calvin Coolidge understood the diversity of America's colonial settlers who came from various and distinct parts of the British corners of the British Isles, and yes, from the Netherlands, just as the experienced political campaigner President Coolidge, 30 years later, understood the diversity of the surge of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, the Ellis Island migration, which was just beginning at the time of his college debate. The Dutch heritage was familiar to literate Americans in Calvin Coolidge's youth. They had read Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. They knew, perhaps, that Martin Van Buren, the 8th president, the founder of the Democratic Party, the world's oldest political party, grew up speaking Dutch in the village of Kinderhook in the Hudson Valley of New York. They were familiar with the figure of Jolly St. Nicholas coming down the chimney from Clement Moore's poem, based on Dutch legends retold by his neighbors in New York's Chelsea neighborhood. They did not yet know, but would learn later, that Theodore Roosevelt, who was appointed New York City Police Commissioner during Calvin Coolidge's senior year at Amherst, grew up in Manhattan in an affluent family that gathered for Sunday dinners at his grandfather's house, where everyone spoke Dutch. The Dutch heritage thus was still tangible, and that's more than 200 years after Peter Stuyvesant surrendered New Amsterdam to the naval forces of James, Duke of York, in what had become by the mid-18th, in the 19th century, the nation's largest city, its leader in manufacturing and commerce, finance, and the arts. The New York where Coolidge's Amherst schoolmates Dwight Morrow and Harlan Fiske Stone made their careers. As the nation's largest and often politically marginal state, New York was a target state, as we call them today, New York also produced political leaders, including the Dutch Americans who occupied the White House for almost 20 of the first 45 years of the 20th century, whose surnames Americans learned to pronounce the Dutch way, Roosevelt. The young Calvin Coolidge was surely familiar with perhaps America's most popular history book in the second half of the 19th century, Thomas Macaulay's History of England from the Accession of James II, a book whose hero was Dutch, William, Prince of Orange, the prime mover of the astonishing and unlikely events that are known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, which installed William and his wife and cousin Mary as King and Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. When Coolidge was delivering his speech on the Declaration in 1926, he was almost exactly the same distance in time from the Glorious Revolution as we are today from the Declaration itself. As I tried to explain for 20th century readers in my 2007 book, Our First Revolution, the remarkable British upheaval that inspired America's founding fathers, William was the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, not a kingdom, but a republic. He was a sort of hereditary army commander-in-chief, dependent, however, for military supply and financing on the votes of the States General, which were elected by each, members of which were elected by each of the 7 Dutch states, whose representatives were in turn chosen by elective representatives of each city. A federal republic based on, as Coolidge put it in 1926, the idea that the people have a right to choose their own rulers. It was a land uniquely in Europe of that time of toleration of faiths and free exercise of religion. It was also a commercial dynamo, the home of the first corporation and of the first national bank, with ships trading around the world, banks financing great enterprises, producing a standard of living and of artistic achievement second to none in Europe. William was also, as the grandson of King Charles I, third in line for the English throne behind his wife, Mary, and her sister Anne. They were all Protestants, but their father, James II, formerly the Duke of York, who had seized New Netherlands, James II was a Catholic, and so was his second wife, who in June 1688 gave birth to a son who threatened to replace the sisters as heirs to the throne. In response, William secretly procured an invitation to come to England signed by 7 lords and assembled an army of 25,000 men and a flotilla of 50 ships. His motive was to forestall James's alliance with Louis XIV of France, the wealthy and aggressive monarch who was amassing absolutist power. 16 years before, at age 21, William had led the Dutch army to open the dikes and flood the lowlands to foil Louis's invasion of the Republic. In fall 1688, his flotilla waited 5 agonizing weeks for what they called the Protestant wind that would blow them down the English Channel and take them in the only successful cross-channel invasion between 1066 and 1944. The many contingencies that could have defeated this daring enterprise did not occur. It's almost astonishing when you go back and read about the number of things that could have gone wrong or failed to happen. But instead, William's army landed and advanced. James fled the kingdom and sailed to France. In Parliament, the Whigs and the Tories, England had already developed political parties in the 1670s and 80s, proclaimed William and Mary as king and queen and voted for a Bill of Rights and a Toleration Act. William agreed that he would spend no money unless it was voted by Parliament, which for the first time would meet every year. Negotiating with the Parliament, as he had negotiated with the States General of the Dutch Republic, he led Britain in war against Louis XIV. Just as he had negotiated financing from the newly rich merchants of Amsterdam, who paid half the Dutch Republic's tax revenues, so he persuaded Parliament to establish the Bank of England, modeled after the Bank of Amsterdam, and a funded debt to finance war with France, which had 4 times the population and riches of Britain. The Dutch King's Glorious Revolution, obviously named by those who favored the operation, was a giant step forward for representative government, for guaranteed liberties, for global capitalism, and for opposition to hegemonic tyrannical powers. And this was a step forward with enormous reverberations for America. King James had been busy abolishing the colonial legislatures in North America. King William restored them, and it was with these legislatures that the founding fathers, Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, hundreds of others, gained their education in what Coolidge in 1926 took care to emphasize was an orderly process of government, which could produce a declaration that was the political action of a duly authorized and constituted representative public body. The founders created a federal republic with sovereign states, a structure closer to the Dutch Republic than the English King and Parliament Act, with an executive commander-in-chief dependent for funding by a Congress chosen by a complicated set of elections and meeting every year. They enacted a Bill of Rights, some of which is a direct copy of its British predecessor, including the Second Amendment. They established a Bank of the United States and a national debt to provide funding for defense and war. They created a framework for a capitalist economy that produced widespread prosperity through technical innovations and traded with all the world, as the Dutch had from Amsterdam and Leiden and Haarlem. In time and by stages, often amid controversy, this American republic has become a participant and then a leader in successful struggles that echoed William of Orange's efforts to cabin in and defeat hegemonic tyrannical powers. Civic equality and religious toleration, representative government and free markets. People can argue how to put these principles into practice, but as principles, as Coolidge argued in 1926, they are final, incapable of further progress. But defending them against those who would lead peoples and nations backward into tyranny can be an exacting challenge. It's a matter of record that in 1939 and 40 and 41, when the hegemonic totalitarian tyrants were allies of Hitler and Stalin were allies in threatening to conquer the entire landmass of Eurasia. The leaders who stood up against them were a British Prime Minister who was a descendant of William Orange's ally in the Glorious Revolution, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, an American president who was a descendant of Hudson Valley Dutch patroons. We don't know whether in October 1894 Calvin Coolidge argued that America owed more to England or to Holland, but given how their histories were braided together in the risky enterprise of the Glorious Revolution, I'd argue that we owe much of what we hold dear to both of them. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Our second speaker is Samuel Gregg. You'll find Sam's full biography in your program. Sam is the Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research and contributing editor at Law and Liberty. But it is on the Scottish thought that Sam is really an expert. He will speak to us today about Adam Smith and the influence of Scottish thought on the founders. Sam?
Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking the Coolidge Foundation and its president, Amity Schlaze, and the generous sponsors for the opportunity to speak at this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. So 1776 was a momentous year for many reasons, and not just because of what Americans annually commemorate on July the 4th. On March the 9th that same year, a book was published that literally changed the world, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We remember this book for launching economics as a distinct social science, as a new way of exploring reality. But in 1776, that tiny number of American colonists who might have read The Wealth of Nations were probably most impressed by its concluding paragraphs. Here Smith argued that the trade restrictions associated with the British Empire would eventually become economically, quote, oppressive and insupportable for the American colonies as their economic development accelerated. In the long term, Smith thought the colonies would decide that the restraints imposed on their trade outweighed the benefits of being part of the empire. So to that extent, The Wealth of Nations gave the American colonists a commercial rationale for becoming independent states. But why, you may ask, would rebellious American colonists be interested in the economic reflections of a Scottish philosopher who had never visited and would never visit North America? The answer is that educated 18th century Americans were intensely interested in all things Scottish. Colonial American educational institutions from New Hampshire to the Carolinas were dominated by Scottish ministers of religion, as personified by the Reverend John Witherspoon, graduate of the University of Edinburgh, minister of the Church of Scotland, president of the College of New Jersey, and signer of the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, 18th century Scotland was full of professors from whom some of the most prominent American revolutionaries absorbed the ideas of that movement we call the Scottish Enlightenment. At William and Mary, for instance, Jefferson was introduced to the ideas of Locke and Newton by Dr. William Small, a graduate of Marshall College, Aberdeen. Jefferson later wrote, quote, "Dr. Small was to me a father. To his enlightened and affectionate guidance of my studies while at college, I am indebted to everything." So whether it was the philosophy articulated by founders like Jefferson or the legal thought embraced by James Wilson, himself a Scot who most likely attended Adam Smith's jurisprudence lectures, Scottish Enlightenment thinkers provided both style and content to the revolutionary generation. Now, I could tell you more about the influence of Scots like the Reverend Hugh Blair on revolutionary rhetoric, or how Smith's Wealth of Nations is the only book in George Washington's library that's annotated in the general's own hand. Let me tell you, however, about one Scot whose influence upon the Declaration has, in my view, been consistently underestimated. Francis Hutcheson is not an American or Scottish household name today, and that has nothing to do with the fact that Hutcheson was in fact Irish. A Presbyterian minister who taught natural religion, morals and jurisprudence at the University of Glasgow between 1729 until his death in 1746, Hutcheson's most famous student was Adam Smith, who described his teacher as, quote, "the never-to-be-forgotten Dr. Hutcheson." While many of Hutcheson's philosophical and economic ideas were taken up and developed by Smith, Hutcheson was neither the Scottish Enlightenment's greatest philosopher nor its most distinguished economic thinker. But Hutcheson's writings were read carefully by Americans' revolutionary generation. Student notes in Philadelphia from as early as 1759, for instance, draw explicitly on Hutcheson's writings like his system of moral philosophy. And in these writings are to be found ideas that underpinned the logic of the Declaration. Hutcheson wrote extensively on the idea of a moral sense shaped by natural reason which led people to virtue. He also alerted his readers to the changes proceeding from the rise of commerce throughout the European world. But Hutcheson's most significant contribution to 18th century thinking was to political thought. And here his articulation of the right of resistance features prominently. Hutcheson had lived through the two Jacobite rebellions that shook 18th century Scotland and which sought to reinstall the Stuart dynasty. He had no illusions, therefore, about the disorder and destruction that flowed from rebellion. And like everyone else at the time, Hutcheson also believed in obligations, whether it was to those of children to parents or of subjects to their rulers. But Hutcheson also insisted upon the right of rebellion, more precisely, people's right to defend themselves against private or public tyranny. Children cannot be bound forever to their parents, servants may leave unjust masters, and the subjects of even the most absolute monarch cannot be tied down forever, even when bound by oaths and contracts. From this argument, Hutcheson derived the idea that colonists cannot be forever bound by debts of gratitude, by sentiment, or by past agreements to the mother country. He subsequently proposed that should the mother country impose, quote, severe and absolute power over its provinces, then the colonies are, quote, not bound to continue in their subjection. They are not, quote, not bound to sacrifice their liberty and happiness to the ambitious views of the mother country while it can enjoy all rational happiness without subjection to it. At the heart of Hutcheson's political theory is thus the principle that the people had the right to resist any government's excesses and even the right to overthrow and replace a government. Colonial subjects, Hutcheson said, had a right to beneficial government, and if they were oppressed by their government, they may justly overthrow their oppressor. To use Hutcheson's words, quote, the people's right to resistance is unquestionable. Hutchinson's claim that badly governed colonies have the right to rebel was widely repeated in colonial America in the 1770s. His words were reprinted in places like Philadelphia, thus providing many patriots with an intellectual rationale for rebellion. But there's another dimension to Hutchinson's contribution to the Declaration. This concerns the Declaration's invocation of Hutchinson's ideas concerning unalienable rights and the pursuit of happiness. In his inquiry into the origin of our ideas of beauty and virtue, Hutchison linked the phrase unalienable rights to the right to resist tyranny. Thanks to Scottish clergymen teaching in North America, this particular idea became embedded in the curriculum of colonial American colleges. It was taught, for instance, by John Witherspoon as part of his moral philosophy course at Princeton. Our rights, Hutchison wrote, are either alienable or unalienable. By unalienable, Hutchison meant rights inherent to our very being as humans. Our rights to our life and liberty, he wrote, are such that we cannot alienate them in the way that we can alienate our rights to our goods and our labor by selling them. Of all the founders, Jefferson was perhaps the most influenced by Hutchison's writings. We know that he held closely to Hutchison's moral sense doctrine, and it is likely that Jefferson drew his reference to unalienable rights when drafting the Declaration from Hutchison. The draft of the Declaration read, as you all know, quote, certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and property. But for Hutchison, property itself was not an unalienable right. However, while our right to property is alienable, we have an unalienable right to acquire, possess, and exchange property. Why? Because, as Hutchison wrote, this is crucial to, quote, the pursuit of happiness. So, taken together, Hutchison's defense of the right of rebellion, of the right of colonies to pursue independence, his articulation of the idea of unalienable rights, and his teaching that the standard of moral goodness is happiness amount to what was then and now a heady mixture of ideas. But so too does the Declaration of Independence. In fact, these three key Hutchisonian points are integral to the Declaration's distinctiveness and endow the Declaration with its revolutionary character. And for that alone, I suggest Francis Hutchison, father of the Scottish Enlightenment, the greatest and most humane of all the Enlightenments, merits your attention today. Thank you.
Sam, thank you very much. Our third speaker is Judge Janice Rogers Brown. Judge Brown is one of the premier jurists of our era. Those of you who were at Coolidge House last night had a chance to appreciate that statement. She was nominated by President George W. Bush to the federal bench. She served on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit from 2005 until her retirement in 2017. Today, Judge Brown will speak about the meaning of the concept of the pursuit of happiness and where it came from. She will also speak on the common law and the English tradition of property rights and its crucial role in the formation of our republic. Judge Brown.
Well, I will, first of all, want to thank the Coolidge Foundation for deciding on this conference. We may be starting a little early, but I think it's well worthwhile that we would begin thinking about this particular anniversary. And since most of my colleagues here have told you about the legacies that we have benefited from, from all of these different streams of ideas. I will, like Henry VIII told several of his wives, not detain you long. I want to speak about just a couple of ideas that I think have helped us to form the kind of legal ideas that are part of America's legacy. Daniel Hainan, several years ago, wrote a book with the very modest title, Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. And he observes that all states develop according to the DNA that was fixed at the moment of their conception. And America is indisputably part of the Anglosphere. And Hatton Summers says there's a straight road which runs from Runnymede to Philadelphia. I'm not sure it was exactly that seamless, because the colonists who came here did, in fact, bring a civilization with them, and it certainly was part of English tradition, English customs. They did not borrow these provisions. They considered them to be part of their own. And our Constitution came up from the body of self-governing people, both before and after our separation from Britain. People on both sides deemed themselves heirs of an inherited folk right of Saxon freedom expressed in the common law, and traced a direct political lineage from the glorious Revolution back to Magna Carta. So what did we get from that? Magna Carta was a legacy bequeathed to America, and interestingly enough, we were more interested in it than the English in the beginning. It's not until 1957 that there's a monument at Runnymede, and that was from the American Bar Association. The English have gotten a little more interested in it as time has gone on, and they put out a very beautiful book on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. But early on, the reverence for that document really was the American reverence. But there's a lot that comes to us from Magna Carta. It represented the idea that individuals should be secure from the arbitrary powers of government. It includes the idea of due process, limits on government power, and particularly a focus on property. And I think that idea of protection of property can be traced right back pretty directly to the Great Charter. Interestingly enough, one of the questions that sometimes arises is, why does the Declaration not say anything about property? And why did that formulation, which was usually life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and estates, why was that changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And did that mean that, in fact, the founders had this idea that they should undermine this idea of property in favor of happiness, and were they talking about public happiness, and therefore less inclined to protect property? And I think, as Samuel Gregg has pointed out, that's not the case. In fact, the Americans were very much concerned about the protection of property, but they saw liberty as relating to property. And so if your life depended on your use of faculties, you would find, like Matterson, that they had this very capacious idea of property. And so this idea of the pursuit of happiness was actually something that they thought of in a quite different way than we might think about happiness now, but it included the ability to pursue and obtain happiness. And some of the state constitutions actually said this very explicitly. In fact, I think is it Vermont? I'm trying to see. Anyway, the protection of property was a paramount aim of the people who guided the American Revolution, and the property could not, it was supposed to be beyond the reach of the sovereign, whether king or legislative majority, and could be taken only as provided by the law of the land. And that was part of what is contained in Magna Carta, this idea of due process, or the law of the land, that the government could not arbitrarily deprive people of their property. And in short, government existed to protect the people's natural rights and the right of possessing and protecting this liberty, which included this protection of property. The other part of what comes down to us, of course, is the common law. And the common law is something that Coolidge liked to talk about. He was part of that cohort of American lawyers who actually studied Blackstone. And one of his famous quotes was that men do not make laws, they do but discover them. Laws must be justified by something more than the will of the majority. They must rest on the eternal foundation of righteousness. But that idea, of course, comes from Blackstone, and Coolidge studied Blackstone and recognized that the way that we think about this, from Blackstone's point of view, was that there is in fact a basis for natural rights, and the basis is that the law derives from the divine law, he would say, from this notion of eternal and universal law. And so this kind of idea you find all through Coolidge's discussions of the Constitution and the role of government. And so the common law, very much a part of something that we inherited from England that made a big difference in American law. And there's a wonderful quote from a man by the name of John Davies, who was Ireland's AG back in 1612. And he says of the common law, it's the most perfect and excellent and without comparison the best way to make and preserve a commonwealth. Well, why does he say that? He says, because written laws are imposed upon the subject without any trial or probation, without any way of knowing whether the same be fit and agreeable to the nature and disposition of the people. But he says, the English made the laws out of their own wisdom and experience. And this is the part of the quote I love. He says, like a silkworm that formeth all of her web out of herself only. But that is very much a tradition that's passed down to us, and a way of thinking about how law should operate, that is slowly and deliberately and as an accretion of actual experience. And that is what we get from the common law. We don't think about common law very much anymore because everything is codified. But in 1926, and when Coolidge was president, there was still a great reliance on common law and the idea of common law. So it seems that there is, from all of the things that we inherited from the English, this idea of due process, of representative government, of the control of the overreach of government. In other words, the idea that government could and should be limited. And also the idea, I think, that's embedded in the common law, of this idea of natural law, which comes down to us very clearly in the Declaration. And the idea that we do not have to invent law. We actually inherit a framework for thinking about right and wrong, good and evil. And that's a legacy that goes directly into the American Revolution and the telos of both the Constitution and the Declaration that is based on natural law.
Janice, thank you. Our fourth speaker is Jerry Muller. Jerry is Professor Emeritus of History at the Catholic University of America. He's the author of 7 books, including Adam Smith in His Time and Ours. And Jerry will speak to us on the influence of Dutch commercialism on the founders. Jerry.
Thank you. Can you hear me back there? Yes. If you can't see me, you're not missing anything. In the 17th century, the most important innovations in thinking about the relationship between politics and commerce were coming from Holland, also known as the Dutch Republic or the United Provinces of the Netherlands. What happened there led to a kind of internal transformation of the civic republican tradition in Western thought. That tradition going back to the ancient Greek city-states that had emphasized the nobility of self-sacrifice on behalf of the city-state, of military service in defense of the state, and participation in government. In that tradition, there was a great suspicion of commerce. People in this tradition typically thought of commerce and the pursuit of wealth as leading to what they called corruption. That is, when citizens put their private material interests above those of the Commonwealth and its defense. Now, in the course of the 17th century, this civic republican tradition was transformed, or to put it another way, it was commercialized, as there was a growing recognition that trade and commerce was an essential element of national power and of political survival. The increase of material wealth came to be seen as part of the logic of state power, because the state needed the material means to be able to conduct war against other states or to protect itself from attacks by other states. And when in the 17th and the 18th centuries, European thinkers considered issues of national power, they inevitably had to think about Holland, the United Provinces of the Netherlands. It was a country without significant natural resources. It was a small country in terms of population. There were only about 2 million people compared to 6 million people in Great Britain at the time. But it was rich. In 1700, the per capita GNP of the United Provinces of the Netherlands was about 50% higher than that of Great Britain. And it was powerful. It was powerful enough militarily to fend off attacks by nations that were far larger in population and in natural resources. And at a time when most countries were ruled as monarchies, it was a republic. One couldn't help but be struck by the fact that these rich and powerful Dutchmen had become powerful through trade. For Holland in the 17th century was the most commercially oriented nation in Europe. How did that happen? Well, since the 16th century, the Dutch had built themselves into a remarkable commercial power. With few natural resources, they became a seagoing and trading people. They pioneered many industries, including the herring industry, which I won't get into now, but believe me, it's fascinating. From the late 16th century, the Dutch became the dominant power in world commerce, a position that they maintained through about 1720. That is to say, for almost a century and a half. How did they do it? Well, for much of the 16th century, the Netherlands, together with what is now Belgium, had been part of the Spanish Empire. In the middle of the century, substantial parts of the population of the Netherlands and Belgium converted to Calvinism. Now, Philip II, the most Catholic emperor of Spain, relied on the Inquisition to try to restore Catholic orthodoxy in the Netherlands, and that led them to a revolt. In the end, the northern provinces, what we now think of as the Netherlands, attained their independence, while the southern provinces, what we now call Belgium, remained part of Philip's Catholic Empire. The main city of the southern provinces was Antwerp, which at the time was the center of European commerce. But Antwerp had a large Calvinist population, and these Calvinists, about 38,000 of them, so about half the population of Antwerp, now moved north to Holland, especially to Amsterdam and to Rotterdam. And they brought with them their capital and their skills in artisanal trades like weaving. Holland also became a magnet for another sort of religious refugees, and that was the Marranos, or crypto-Jews. These people their ancestors had been Jews in Spain. In 1492, the Jews of Spain were expelled from Spain to Portugal, and shortly thereafter, when Portugal came under Spanish control, they were expelled from there as well. Some of them went to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, like Brazil. They often did so not as Jews, but as crypto-Jews, that is, people who had formally converted to Catholicism, but continued to practice their Judaism to one degree or another. And some of them also went to Antwerp, which was the center of commerce at the time. And then after that, after the Dutch revolt, many of them went on to Amsterdam, where some of them reverted back to Judaism. Think of the family of Benedictus Spinoza, for example. By the way, when you think about the Declaration of Independence and the reference to nature and nature's God, has a very Spinozist ring of a document that was written by deists, after all. And these people brought with them their capital, and more important, their commercial contacts that these Marranos had in Spain and Portugal and the Spanish Empire. In short, and this became the second lesson of the Dutch experience, Holland profited by becoming a center of religious toleration. And so by the mid-17th century, the Dutch were clearly the most commercially oriented nation in Europe. They dominated world trade. And to make it easier to gather funds for new ventures, they created stock markets at which shares of companies like the East India Company could be bought and sold, a hugely important innovation. And the United Provinces were also the center of international finance, with the founding, as Michael has mentioned, of the Bank of Amsterdam, which was founded in 1609 and was the most important bank in Europe. And Holland wasn't just a trading state. By the mid-17th century, it had developed a number of industries as well. So Holland was the wealthiest and most urbanized region of Europe. It overflowed with food, drink, and tobacco. One shining example of that wealth came in 1669 when Amsterdam became the first city to have public street lighting. And Holland was perhaps the first society in which a majority of households made the switch in allocation of time towards production for the market rather than for household use. And so for people who thought about politics and what we would now call public policy, the Dutch experience was one that called out for attention. Dutch politicians and political publicists began writing books on the links between the preservation of the Republic and commercial strength. Peter de la Court, a textile manufacturer from Leiden, who had turned into a political publicist, in 1662 published a book in Dutch called The Interests of Holland. And there he linked Republican themes to free trade by arguing that the power of Holland to defend itself depended upon its free trade policies. Here were three of his most important maxims. Freedom for all people that will cohabit with us to follow any occupation for a livelihood. That was one. Secondly, that monopolizing companies and guilds which exclude all other persons from their societies are very prejudicial to Holland. So when you put these together, it was a plea for the advantages of free trade internally. And the third of the maxims was that toleration regarding the worship of God is a powerful means to preserve many inhabitants in Holland and attract foreigners to dwell among us. Some decades later, in 1702, this book was translated into English under the title The True Interests and Political Maxims of Holland. And so by the early 18th century, we increasingly find thinkers about politics writing about commerce as part of politics, giving rise to what came to be called political economy, especially in the works of the great Scottish thinkers David Hume and Adam Smith. And these themes of the advantages of free trade and the advantages of religious toleration, which came out of the Dutch experience into Britain, through Scotland, and to the American founders, formed what you might call part of the mental furniture of the founding generation of the United States.
Jerry, thank you. We're going to go to a session, or the session will move now into questions. I'm going to pose a few questions for the panel, and then in 10 minutes or so, I'm going to open it up for you all to ask some questions. So be thinking about some that you might want to pose to the panel. But before we do that, I'd like to ask the panel to put a little bit more thought and flesh out a little bit more for us the link between property rights and individual or human rights, the importance of that linkage. And I think the linkage is very important, and I suspect that many of you students here have heard very little in your training, in your classes at school about the linkage. So I hope you'll take away from this session that there is an important link there. The historian Paul Johnson has written that all the founders derived from John Locke the notion that security of one's property was intimately linked to one's freedom. And John Adams wrote, "Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." So let me just ask anybody on the panel to speak up. Janice, you touched on this, but everybody jump in and see if you can help us with that linkage a little bit.
Well, let me begin with a skeptical note. As Friedrich Hayek and others have noted, property rights are a historically changing thing and have to be as the natures of society change. So let's remember that as has already been alluded to, for many of the founders, their most important form of property was the slaves that they owned, right? Nowadays, we don't tend to think that that's a very good form of property and that it's not very conducive to individual liberty, and it isn't. But it's a reminder that property rights are not something that are eternal and obvious, but constantly need to be redefined as the nature of society and economies change over time. So let's begin with that.
Can I add something to that? Francis Hutcheson, when he was talking about these rights to liberty and life, etc., when he talked about property, one of the things he made very clear was that he didn't think slaves were property. So this is an example of that development that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. He's one of the first philosophers to really come out and say slavery needs to be done away with. But the other thing I'd like to say is that if you look at the jurisprudence of the period, and not just people like Hugo Grotius or Samuel von Pufendorf, who were continental European scholars of natural law who would write extensive works of jurisprudence. But also if you look at people like Adam Smith and his lectures on jurisprudence, what you find is that the bulk of it is actually about property. Most of it's about property. And by property, I don't literally mean just owning land. It's things like contract law, tort law, these sorts of things. So that it's very important because I think that when it comes to understanding the Declaration in the American Revolution, this concept of property, which, as Professor Mueller points out, is changing as an idea. The core idea of property is being something that's extremely important for human liberty and very important for the development of commerce and exchange, is at the foremost front of a lot of these thinkers' minds. So it's not a coincidence that you find so many of the American revolutionaries talking about this over and over and over again, because so many of them had been educated in institutions. When they're going and attending their courses on law, which of course they all had to, they're hearing discussions about property over and over and over again.
Excuse me. One other thing I think, the societies that we're talking about, Netherlands, England, the British North American colonies, you had widespread ownership of land to a much greater extent than you did in many other places. You did not have serfdom. The British North American colonies had slavery. One of the effects of the Revolution was getting rid of slavery, of indentured servitude. Sort of dies out. The idea that you pay for your way over to North America by working for somebody for 3 years. That sort of disappears in the Revolution. And you also have in the 1780s, in the wake of the Revolution, you have Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire through judicial decision, Connecticut and Rhode Island, having an abolition of slavery, not an immediate abolition, but over time, a gradual abolition of slavery. This was an idea that was sweeping the things, and as the governor pointed out, Vermont set the standard in 1777. But this is an idea that makes great advances in the wake of the American Revolution, and those words in the Declaration that are sort of hard to square with slavery, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I think in modern times, one of the things that we've seen is an idea that sort of separates property rights from personal rights and says personal rights are very important, but property rights not so important. So let me just go back to a Coolidge quote where he says, "We need not concern ourselves much about rights of property if we faithfully observe the rights of person." And I think what he's getting at there is what I was trying to say earlier, is that at every stage of this controversy in 1776, Americans claimed to be defending property rights, which they deemed a prerequisite to the pursuit of happiness. And Madison has a very capacious definition of property. He does a very short little essay in which he talks about property, and he says, you have property in your opinions, you have property in your faculties, Your faculties are what's necessary for you to sustain your life, right? So without that, neither life nor liberty is possible. And I think this, that the acquisition of property and the pursuit of happiness were so closely connected that they sometimes named one to evoke both of them. So the New Hampshire Constitution makes this point explicit. It says all men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending of life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and in a word, seeking and obtaining happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So they look at this, I think, that their view of property includes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You
Clear
can't have,
linkage.
Yeah.
I want to touch for just a minute on, we've talked about the different influences, English, Dutch, Scottish, but talk for a minute about the differences among the 13 colonies. The colony, we tend to, I think, lump all of the colonies together, think that, there was a cohesive American viewpoint, which was really not the case at the beginning of the Revolution, and some of the colonies were influenced differently than others. Anybody want to speak to that, differences you've seen among the colonies?
Well, one of the things that, if you examine this, if you look before the 1750s, the colonies, each colony sort of had its own relations with London. They had their own specific religious traditions, the Congregationalists, Calvinists in New England, Dutch Reform in New York, Catholic ownership in Maryland, Anglicans in Virginia and South Carolina. When Benjamin Franklin suggests in the 1750s the idea that the colonies should act as a unit, this is kind of a new idea. And one of the things that it becomes apparent to the colonies, to the young republic, when they're putting together a republic, is that you need, you have this variety of religious backgrounds, and we're talking about people who understood that European history was largely a history in the recent centuries of religious warfare. That you had to have religious toleration, you had to allow the free exercise of religion, and you had to enable people of very strong different beliefs in order to live together in one federal polity. And that comes out, of course, in the First Amendment, but it's part of the ideas that the Revolution gives birth to. Because of the fact that it was obvious to the revolutionaries that they were dealing with a lot of cultural diversity between the different colonies. And the example of the Dutch toleration is important there. The example of Britain that works out its 17th century religious wars with the solution in the Glorious Revolution in 1689, and a Toleration Act, which was not really complete toleration, but a step in that direction, was something that they were going to have if they were going to become a single nation.
Can I add something
Sure.
to that? I would add to that economic diversity as well. If you look at the northern colonies, you find a commercial orientation. You can already see the beginnings of what we would call a type of industrialization. The southern colonies are very different. It's very much a very rural society, obviously tobacco, cotton, slavery, etc. And I think you see this start to manifest itself after the revolution because of the differences, and this is, I think, personified by the different visions of America that you find with Jefferson on the one hand, sort of agricultural, small farms, and in the North, you have someone like Hamilton who sees America's future as with finance and commerce and developing the sinews of what you might call a modern industrial economy. So I do think even before the revolution, you can see some significant economic differences between North and South.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to open it up, and if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, and I don't know if we got some mics out. Yeah, okay. There's one over here.
I had a question about the right of rebellion. So you talked about certain unalienable rights as well as the right of rebellion. And so I was wondering, is there like an order or ranking to these rights? In case they infringe upon each other, which one would take precedence?
Well, as I said, certainly when Hutchison talked about unalienable rights, which is the phrase, it's not inalienable rights, it's unalienable rights in the Constitution. When he talked about it, he makes it very clear that life, he speaks of them together, life and liberty, they're basically linked like that. And property is an alienable right. It's essential for the pursuit of happiness, but you can sell your property. You can give away your property. Your property is usually inherited by someone, so it's alienable. To the extent that it's alienable, it's secondary to life and liberty. But they also make it very clear that without this alienable right to property, it's very difficult to pursue happiness, it's very difficult to pursue liberty, it's very difficult to preserve your life. So I think there is a type of hierarchy, but you see that they're mutually reinforcing.
Okay, another question. Let's see, one right here.
Oh, sorry. Hello. So I had 2 quick questions, please, for the panel. So one, speaking to Mr. Regg's point about the different sorts of economies that emerged in the North and the South, I think it's a little bit interesting that we find people like Jefferson supporting strongly free markets. They support free trade, hard money, and they also support an agricultural society. But then you have people like Hamilton who support commerce and also greater government intervention. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on why some of the founders thought that greater commerce implied greater government intervention or the inverse.
Well, I'll start. The first thing to understand is people are not always consistent in the way they think about the world. So that's the first thing. So in the South, you have people like Jefferson, who's very much an advocate of free trade. He's read Adam Smith. He's very much convinced by the intellectual argument for that. And he's also thinking, frankly, of his own and own interests and those of the South, because that's trade. They want to trade. They want to send tobacco. They want to send cotton, all these other things to European. So getting into protectionist wars with European powers is not a good idea for people like Jefferson. Someone like Hamilton. Hamilton says very clearly that he accepts the intellectual arguments of Adam Smith. He says these are very difficult to refute. But he also goes on and says, well, we also live in a world of nation states. These nation states are, well, they're states. They're going to become nation states. But these states are very antagonistic towards each other. Therefore, we need to build up an industrial base, and that's why we need some type of protectionism. Now, I do think that Hamilton's protectionist credentials are highly exaggerated. He talks primarily about things like military necessity. He talks about things that he thinks America's going to need in times of war, particularly if it's going to get in wars with European powers. But that is, I think, some of the differences between them. So it's not that they necessarily disagree about the emerging economic theory of how the world works. They have different appreciations of, I think, of what America's place in the world is going to be. And I think Jefferson sees America as, apart from trading with other countries, relatively isolated from the rest of the world, whereas Hamilton is taking a view of, maybe we would be nice to be isolated, but we're not. We have a British Empire that we've just left. They're not very happy with us. We have this thing called the Spanish Empire, which actually owns most of North America at the time. We have the French who want to get back into Louisiana, maybe into North America as well. So Hamilton is being driven, I think, very much by what we would call geopolitical considerations. And his view of that is very different to something that the type of vision that's being articulated by Jefferson.
Good, thank you.
Can I just add a bit to that? I agree fully with what you said, but it's important to keep in mind that for Hamilton, he's looking at a new young country that, as Samuel says, has to defend itself, but he also wants it to be a major country. And he says to be a major country nowadays, in when he writes his report on manufacturers about 1790. We need to be an industrial country. We need to be able to produce all the things that we need for our own consumer goods and for national defense and so on. And he says, if we're a young country, we want to attract people, we want to attract entrepreneurial people from around the world, and there's more room for entrepreneurialism and innovation in a manufacturing economy than in an agricultural economy. So he's in many ways, and lots of people have written about this, one of the first developmental economists, thinking about a new nation and what you need to do to make it a powerful nation.
It's also the tariff. The tariff is easy to collect. It's just a practical thing. You need a certain amount of money to maintain a military defense and post office and so forth. So what could you tax easily? The answer is tariff and alcohol. And the government exists, apart from the Civil War, largely on those things until it comes to about in the 1910s, when it decides it doesn't want to have alcohol anymore, loses the tax source, and decides, hey, what about an income tax?
I guess that was called progress at the time, right?
Well, Coolidge reduced it rates.
Okay, over here.
Professor Muller, I was delighted, over here on your left.
Hi.
I was delighted to hear you mention Baruch, or Benedict Spinoza.
Yes.
And we have this amazing juxtaposition of the division of the Netherlands, the immigration from Spain of the persecuted minorities, and then Baruch is actually excluded from his own community, and then some scholars say that he's influenced Locke and Leibniz and several other philosophers. I just wonder, and I think your reference to the natural law and the word happiness substituted for property in of the three inalienable rights, I think may have some roots in that amazing combination of events from the Netherlands through the Glorious Revolution and into the philosophy of the Declaration. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not sure about the direct influence of Spinoza on the founders, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of indirect influence. Jonathan Israel has written several huge volumes on this process of conveying and transforming Spinoza's influence over time. It's worth thinking about in this regard the fact that I think the Jefferson Bible is here in the Library of Congress. And the Jefferson Bible is a very interesting document. Jefferson took the New Testament and he literally cut out all the miracles, right? Leaving just what he thought of as the moral messages of the Gospels. That's a kind of Spinozist editing, as it were, of the Bible. And so there is that kind of either direct or indirect influence, yes.
And Coolidge students, if you could give your name and where you're from before your question, that'd be kind of nice.
Yeah. Oh, hello. Oh, okay. Yes, it works. Hi. First of all, thank you for speaking. It was incredibly informative, and it's an honor to be here and with all the other Coolidge scholars and senators to learn from you. My name is Elizabeth Schwartz. I am from Staten Island originally, and I am a sophomore at Yale University. And so I want to go back to the idea of alienable versus unalienable rights. And to sort of the foundation of this question is the quote from Justice Janice Rogers Brown, which is, we do not create laws, we discover them. And so I want to ask you, because I'm curious to hear your perspective on this question, about the alienable right to property, but the unalienable right to happiness, and to sort of apply it in a modern context, because what is theory for if not for application? So homelessness increased 18% in 2024, and there's a mixture of reasons: inflation, landlords sort of price gouging short-term housing, and also private firms buying up empty apartments. And so I know there's a huge emphasis in the world of Coolidge and also in the free market economy to limit government intervention as much as possible. I want to ask you, to what extent should the government intervene if the right to happiness, if the right to property is being precluded by corporations, by entities more powerful than individuals or citizens themselves? You know, is there a point at which, we need a little bit of pushback to make sure that we can have this right to property, because owning a home is literal, having literal access to property and also to all the benefits of owning a home that symbolize the achievement of the American dream. And so my question is, how do we balance that need for autonomy and also finding methods to increase access to that, to increase the equity of conditions, not necessarily, even if the outcomes aren't equal, how do we make the conditions more equal by following these principles? Are there exceptions? Is this one of them?
I want to speak to that.
Wow.
You've got 2 minutes.
Woo, there is so much in that and so much to unpack, and so I hope that some of the other panelists can help me out here. But let me start with the idea that maybe there's sort of a misunderstanding of this notion of pursuit of happiness. It really is pursuit, and as I have come to understand it, it is a personal journey. It's really talking about the ability of people to do this for themselves, right? To figure out how to live virtuously, how to, and so it's not. If I understand your question, it's almost like you're taking this view of public happiness, that is, that government has a responsibility, right, to make sure that people are happy. And then you use this term, sort of equity of outcome, which.
Sorry, I want to clarify that.
Okay.
The goal of this question, the goal of government intervention or no intervention isn't equity of outcome, it's equity of condition. And I also want to clarify that what I mean is it's incredibly difficult to pursue happiness when you're homeless. To pursue virtue when you're homeless. And so that is my question of why we should take about government intervention to whatever extent.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. The assumption here, of course, is that restriction to people's difficulties in acquiring housing, in pursuing whatever path of happiness, that somehow government intervention is the way in which you can make that happen more easily. It's a way, but it's also a very bad way. That's, I think, part of the message of. If you read, for example, someone like a Smith or a Hayek or any number of what we might call free market political economists, one of the things they point out is the way in which government intervention actually makes it very hard for individuals, let alone groups, let alone families, to take advantage of their liberties, to pursue their happiness, to acquire the things that they need for a happy life. So you mentioned, for example, you were talking about the housing situation, you were referring to various difficulties that a lot of Americans have, particularly young Americans, in terms of trying to advance themselves economically and on a personal level. The notion that America is this sort of highly unregulated, laissez-faire economy is just not true. We're a very heavily regulated economy. And if you want to understand why things like the housing market are the way they are, I think you have to look very carefully at the sheer amount of regulation that makes it harder for people to afford housing, to get loans in the first place. So we have no shortage of government intervention in the United States economy. This is something a lot of people from outside America, they think of America as this sort of dynamic, capitalist, laissez-faire, Ayn Rand-like society. It's definitely not. And I would argue that what you want, what you're pointing to, I think, is an admirable and good thing. But I think we underestimate the degree to which, let's say, good intentions, sometimes good intentioned interventions actually make this harder for people to achieve.
Thank you. I'm going to call time on us here, but I want to thank our panel. It's been a great panel, and I would encourage you all to